In 2018, Lucasfilm Publishing handpicked a group of 5 of the top Star Wars writers, nicknamed the All-Star Initiative, and they gathered them at the famous Skywalker Ranch in California to discuss the major plot points to something nicknamed Project Luminous. The group was soon joined by an additional small handful of authors, and the team would go on to create the High Republic Publishing Initiative, which is a massive yet cohesive set of stories set across a previously untouched 250-year time chunk in the Star Wars galaxy. But not just through books. It started with a short story in 2020 and concluded with a comic just days ago in the summer of 2025. But the publishing consisted of the following mediums: 8 adult novels, 8 young adult novels, 10 junior novels, 3 young reader books, 3 audio dramas, 127 comics, 6 mangas, 32 short stories, 2 short story collections, and 1 reference book. So join me as I attempt to do the extremely irresponsible thing of summarizing my thoughts on hundreds of hours of media in about a 10-minute review. Now, I have something to admit. I have only read all of the adult novels, all of the audio dramas, all 127 comics, all of the mangas, and a handful of short stories. Meaning I have not read a lot of the young adult and children's content, but I've read just about everything else. So, like a Reddit commenter, I am here to give my opinion on something that I don't fully grasp, I guess. But no, all jokes aside, this will largely be a review of what I consider to be the backbone of the publishing initiative, which is the adult novels, as well as, what I would consider the sidekick, which is the comics and maybe the mangas as well, but mostly the adult novels. Speaking of what's considered important, I would consider the importance of the High Republic Publishing Initiative to kind of be like a pyramid. So on the bottom layer, it's like the most foundational layer, and that is the adult novels. All the major plot events for the initiative are going to happen in those. Think of it kind of like the movies of the publishing initiative, the Star Wars movies of the publishing initiative. The importance of the rest of the content is going to be hotly debated within the fandom, but in my opinion, I would say that on the next rung up, you've probably got the young adult novels and comics. Well, on a rung above that, you've got the mangas, junior novels, young reader novels, and audio dramas. And then on like the top rung, you've got like the stuff like the short stories and the reference books and stuff. Again, this is a super rough estimate on my end. The point I'm just trying to make is that not every piece of content in this initiative is created equal. They just can't be. The most major events in the overall story of the High Republic are going to be in those adult novels. And then as you make your way up this pyramid that I've described, things get more auxiliary to the main storyline of the initiative. And I loved how this format worked. I'll get into it more later, but I just really liked how this kept the barrier of entry quite low compared to just the massive body of work that this publishing initiative envelops. Let me just really quickly summarize the structure of the publishing initiative as well. So there are 3 phases in the High Republic, and each of these 3 phases is divided into 2 or 3 waves. So each wave gets its own adult novel, and that adult novel presents the main conflict of the wave in the phase. Yeah, I know it's kind of confusing, but just bear with me. The phases are structured just like the Star Wars movie trilogies. So you've got phase 1, and that takes place, and then phase 2 takes place 150 years in the past, and then phase 3, when it comes along, it just picks up right where phase 1 left off in the timeline. The phase structure, as well as the hierarchy of works that I just talked about, it does a great job at keeping the initiative focused, and it does a really good job at maintaining a cohesive plotline in what could have otherwise been a potentially really confusing bunch of works. I think this thing is coming along. I like the steering wheel that I just added. Oh shit. All right, now that we've done our chores and we've talked about the structure of the publishing initiative, let's talk about something that's actually cool, the universe of the High Republic. If you didn't know already, the High Republic is part of the Star Wars universe, and it actually takes place about 200 years before Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. This is when the Republic, and more importantly the Jedi, are at their zenith. They are walking around sporting their flashy robes, they're sticking to their morals, and just generally they're quite well liked. In general, this is kind of a Renaissance era in the Star Wars universe. The Jedi are kind of going to all these new lands and they're welcoming new people and races and species into the Republic. The Jedi are generally very accepting and they have a super liberal and open-minded view of how the Force works. It's also a time of significant scientific progress. Brilliant minds are supported in their pursuit and creation of new technology. In general, vibes are good. So let's go along and talk a little bit about the universe within the context of this publishing initiative. Even if you've watched all the Star Wars movies, or even if you've read a few of the comics or read some of the novels, a lot of the High Republic is going to feel new to you. Yeah, there are lightsabers and ships and the Force, but most of what you're reading page to page will feel new. In a timeline that has become otherwise extremely bloated, such that authors are trying to cram in 100 major events, it seems like, within the span of like 10 years, the authors getting to work on like this relatively untouched segment of Star Wars history it's really refreshing. The authors get to tell their own stories largely without the interference or constraints from other major canon events, which is a real novelty in Star Wars storytelling. So as much as anything that's actually within the Star Wars universe can be, this does feel like the authors were able to carve out their own sci-fi universe within Star Wars. The big issue with something like this is that you can't rely on previously created stakes in the way that most Star Wars content does. The authors, they just can't rely on tying in their stories to previously created things like blowing up the Death Star or Palpatine's return or the Battle of Endor. They have to create their own stakes. And this is something they do, in my opinion, incredibly well throughout the series. Like literally the first chapter of the first book, they have this thing called the Great Hyperspace Disaster. And this is a huge event. And then pretty much every of the following adult novels have some sort of seminal event that gets referenced repeatedly throughout the series. And this recurrence does a great job bolstering the importance of such events so that by the end of me reading this entire bunch of media, something like the Republic Fair on Valo, which happens in Book 2, it feels as much Star Wars to me as something like Order 66 or the Battle of Hoth. And all of those main events do happen in the adult novels, so you don't have to worry about missing monumental moments if you just want to read those. But that's not to say that reading the YA books or comics or mangas won't add depth and critical information about a bit more minor events as well. When I read the Book of the New Sun, I often found passages frustrating because they were clearly referencing something religiously or contextually that I just didn't have the background to understand. But even for stuff in this series that references content from the side material, like a manga or an audio drama, it doesn't feel like they just hang you out to dry. References are more like Easter eggs massaged into the story rather than distracting references. Let me give you an example. So in one of the adult novels that I read, someone is walking on a new planet, and they find this abandoned Jedi ship and lightsaber. Now, when I read this, I thought this was just a quirk of this weird planet that they were on. But I learned after reading the book that apparently one of the plot lines in a young adult book centers around the Jedi that crashed and died on that planet, leaving their ship and saber there. Now, did I need to know that? No. But was that moment probably super, super cool for someone who read the YA book? Hell yeah. In fact, I'd go as far as to call Phase 2 the flashback phase a little bit unnecessary. It provides gratifying background, but you can still understand what's going on if you just read the first and the third phases. And thus lies the beauty of the initiative. The more content you consume, the more you get out of it. And it feels linear and it feels consistent in how it rewards readers for how much they've read. It's starting to look like an actual land speeder now. I kind of like this thing. Check it out. I talked earlier about how I think that this publishing initiative has the unique element of being the most cut off of the Star Wars universe of anything I've read in Star Wars. And I think that that is most apparent within the characters. You're not getting Luke Skywalker, Vader is not showing up, and somehow Palpatine does not return. But there are a ton of new characters, and to be honest, this felt a little bit overwhelming at first. So much so that actually for the first couple of books, I had this document that I made on like Google Drive or whatever that was just pictures of characters and their names underneath, so that whenever someone showed up, I'd be like, oh, that's right, that's that guy. But it definitely gets better as the series goes on. There are new characters introduced, but plenty of the main characters, they recur in the books, comics, mangas, etc., all their storylines. And there are hits and misses. Some of my favorite Star Wars characters, period, were created for this initiative. Shout out Ty York and shout out Quart. But there were also some characters that I liked less as well. But it's not exactly like I thought they were super poorly written or anything like that. It's more so just that they didn't really click with me. It's kind of like when you're watching like a reality TV show like The Amazing Race or like Love Island for you Brits out there. When your favorite contestant is on screen, you're going to sit up and you're going to be more engaged and interested. And it's not like when they're not on the screen, you turn the TV off or anything. You just might not care quite as much. In fact, one of the main Jedi I was not really a big fan of, but by no means did that ruin anything for me. There are so many characters of every shape, size, species, and structure that nobody has ever really dwelled upon for too long. And another thing that's a huge benefit of having characters that are generally cut off from the rest of the Star Wars universe is that they can do whatever the hell they want with these characters, right? And that is a complete rarity in Star Wars. Most of the well-known Star Wars characters, they have all of their major life events predetermined by movies or TV shows, meaning that the stakes of any story they tell about them can only be so high. With completely new characters in a completely new era, the sky is the limit in this publishing initiative. They can kill off whatever character they want to. And they do. They can create any sort of galaxy-defining event that they want to. And they do that as well. No set of characters is complete without some killer antagonists. And as is a recurring theme in this review, the authors of this initiative can't rely on the low-hanging fruit of just pitting the good guys up against the Empire or Vader or Palpatine or some new Sith. One of the recurring lines for the advertisement for this publishing initiative was, "What do the Jedi fear?" And while I think that the main villain of the series was a little bit boilerplate, stereotypical evil bad guy for me, I think the authors completely hit the nail on the head with the other threats in the publishing initiative, of which there are many. I don't know, I feel like we're pretty much done, but we still got like 4 bags left, so I don't know. We'll see what we add. Okay, so there's a bunch of new characters, and it takes place over 1 million books and comics, but does it feel consistent? Does it feel cohesive? Yes. I think probably the most dangerous thing to an initiative like this, beyond just the obvious of like making sure everything fits together, is the risk of feeling like each author has their own agenda to push when it's their time to shine. But this group of authors felt like they were all on the same page. I listened to a ton of YouTube interviews throughout my reading of the books, and it was really cool to hear how apparently they had this like consistent line of communication during the entirety of the creative process through things like group chats, consistent meetings, and even that now famous meeting at Skywalker Ranch that I talked about earlier that was at the genesis of the initiative, at which they planned out like all of the main plot points and big themes of the series. Even though the books, comics, mangas, etc. are all written by a variety of authors, they all keep the same feel. They're wholesome, they're a bit goofy, they're pulpy, and first and foremost, they are all adventurous. Hardcore fans might be a little bit angry at me for saying this, but it does feel a little bit childish at sometimes. But I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. It kind of reminds me of like young adult novels, which I very often enjoy. There's a youthful pulpiness to the content, something that I think is really welcome and maybe even kind of necessary in the space opera genre. The messages tend to be more straightforward, similar to a lot of young adult novels, but they're not meant to be philosophical novels. They are action-adventure books, and that sense of wonder and exploration is something well captured by each author. Probably like a lot of you, when I'm reading a book or a comic or a manga or whatever, and I stumble across a good quote that means something to me, I write it down. And no, this series does not have as many things that I jotted down as when I'm reading something like Ballard or Vonnegut, but there is a respectable amount. There is a general dialogue about what it means to be good, what it means to fight and when fighting is necessary, the value of peace and second chances, and plenty more. Check it out. That's pretty sick. I could spend some time talking about how extremely satisfying I found the end of this collection of works to be, but honestly, I just don't think it matters too much. Maybe it's a quirk of my own interests, but I think that it's kind of stupid to read an extremely long series just for like a satisfying conclusion in the final book or something like that. To me, it has to be something with a pretty good like friends along the way sort of payoff. And to me, it hits. I mean, by the end of the series, a character or a planet would be named, and I would flash back to all those moments that I shared with that person or that place in the last many books and comics or what have you that I had read. And it added considerable weight to those later moments. That's not to say that there weren't decisions that I disagreed with, though. Particularly in phases 2 and 3, I kind of disliked how it leaned more into the fantasy side of Star Wars rather than the science fiction side, which I prefer through things like magical artifacts that can like manipulate the Force and animals and stuff like that. So that's not my favorite, but the variety of storytelling and plot lines, even within like a single novel or a single comic, means that if a character or even like a plot line is not your cup of tea, then you won't be with it for too long anyway. While I would say that the first and third phase adult novels are pretty much completely necessary to your understanding of this publishing initiative, there is still a lot of flexibility within the initiative. Like, let's say, for example, you really liked The Rising Storm, Cavan Scott's novel. Then you could just go read all of his comics and just, be a big fan of him. That's a totally fine and appropriate way to go about the High Republic. It can definitely be taken as more of a piecemeal amalgamation of stories rather than requiring a strict adherence to some reading order. It's a big ask to ask someone to read 8+ novels, tons of comics, and a variety of other media. So I'm not going to do that. This content is not for everyone. And if you don't feel like you enjoy the first few chapters of the first book, that's okay. It might not be for you. There is plenty of great SF out there. But for me, the journey was worth it. Like any production that has this ambitious of a scope, there were concepts and characters and plot lines that I wasn't a huge fan of, but overall, I have this series to thank for some of my favorite Star Wars characters and hours of great reading. If you're looking to immerse yourself in a vast, expansive, and thoughtfully put together universe, I hope you have as much fun reading this as I did. Thanks for watching.
lovely.